Hello, insiders, and welcome to this new episode of the EU Bubble Insider. Today, our guest is Martyna Bildziukiewicz, head of East Stratcom Taskforce of the European External Action Service. Martyna, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, if we could start our interview today by explaining what is the European East Stratcom Taskforce and what are the roles you and your team play?
Well, the team has been in place since 2015, and this is when the European Council, so the European leaders on the highest political level, gave the mandate for the East Stratcom Task Force to start working. And their mandate was quite clear to address and counter Russia's disinformation campaigns. And that was the time when the leaders were already quite well informed about what happened a year before, which was the annexation of Crimea, which was Russia attacking the east of Ukraine, which was also when the MH17 airplane was shot down. And we already knew back then that all those events were accompanied by large scale disinformation campaigns. And so leaders thought, well, first of all, we need to help Ukraine and other Eastern Partnership countries tackle this. But also, there was this reflection already back then that it's quite possible that if Russia tries this in Ukraine and in other Eastern Partnership countries, it will also try in the European Union. So, this is why the task force was created. And in those first few years, there were only a few colleagues working on the whole really big challenge. And I think it's never enough to thank them for what they created back then, because what they really did is still the foundation of what we do today. We concentrate on three things. The first one is direct reaction to disinformation. So this is what you can see in our EU versus Disinfo project. This is eu-disinfo.eu. It's a website, and it's also a social media campaign. We're in most big social media. We're present there, and you can look EU versus Disinfo up. And so this is the public-facing side of our work, where we try to explain what disinformation is in quite simple terms. We also use a lot of humor, we use a lot of irony, and when it is needed, we think, we also confront Russia's disinformation actors directly. There were quite a few examples of our actions last year when Russia really stepped up its disinformation game after already before and also after it invaded Ukraine full scale, but I can maybe elaborate on that later on. In any case, this is what everyone can see, this part of the work. It's publicly available. Everything that we do is available in English and in Russian. Some of the content is also translated into several other languages, including Ukrainian. We do this a lot these days, but also, for example, Polish, French, German, Italian, and Spanish, and a few other languages. So this is still only the first part of the work. What we also do is we focus quite a lot, especially right now, on so-called proactive communications, which means, when disinformation leaves a huge information void, this void needs to be filled with credible information about the EU, about its policies. And this part of the job of the work was at first directed mostly at the Eastern Partnership countries, but it also evolved to cover other regions of the world too. And then the third part of our work is support to independent media. And this is focusing mostly, as far as my team's work is concerned, on the Eastern Partnership countries and to some extent on Russia as well. On top of that, we are part of a larger division that is also working on policy measures to tackle disinformation, but it's maybe a separate topic to cover.
So I hope that I will not say anything politically incorrect, but isn't it like you're in the front of an actual war that's the EU has to fight, because we're not at any war except the war against disinformation, and the front seems to be enormous. And my question here would be, how do you enjoy a job like this? How often do you can you count that you succeeded in something, and what do you find fulfilling in the work you do?
That's a really great question. Thank you for that. Well, it does feel like we're at war sometimes, especially since the 24th of February 2022. Uh, and one of the biggest challenges that we face in this battle is that it's not an even war, in the sense that we are not up against someone that uses the same methods, that uses the law, that actually holds dear values such as democracy or rule of law, or freedom of speech, by that matter. Um, on the other side of this war is Russia and also other malign actors that use completely different methods that we will never want to use on the EU side. And so this is why it's so uneven, and I would even say unfair, because Russia really doesn't care about the law, doesn't care about its citizens, doesn't care about the international community, doesn't care about the people, especially about the Ukrainian people. And so it uses all possible methods. We call them, actually, from more technical perspective, tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs for short. So Russia uses over 250 such TTPs to manipulate and distort the information environment. And when I speak about TTPs, this is about, for example, promoting forged letters, or using the whole networks in different social media that are inauthentic to advance Russia's narratives. And these are just really two examples out of many, many that I could name. So yes, this is a difficult job, I have to admit, but at the same time, it's an important contribution, I think, that we make, and I think the whole team would agree that this is what motivates us. We are here to really defend European democracy as much as we can, and also to help our Ukrainian friends and the whole like-minded community in different countries, in different parts of the world that sees the threat of disinformation in the same way. What I really enjoy about this work, and there is a lot to enjoy actually, even though it's so difficult, is, for example, the possibility to work with so many different people, including independent journalists and civil society, because quite an important part of our work is also to to build a community and to work with those people that actually know the situation best from the ground, from their own work. And so one of the things that we do is, for example, a capacity building event. There were several of those this year, where we bring together journalists from different parts of the world for trainings for, exactly, capacity building. So this means that they can broaden their knowledge about ways to fight with disinformation, to recognize it, and also to speak, to build their audiences, to speak to their communities. And when they are provided with such information, such knowledge, they can bring this further to their communities. So this is how we also build the response, and a spine, if you like, a stronger one to defend ourselves against it. And this is what I really, really enjoy in my job. I really can talk to many different people from different walks of life, and I feel like we're building something, which is very important.
And your background combines journalism, diplomacy, among others. Could you reflect maybe on what experience from your past career helps you do your job well today?
Well, I think everything that I did before is actually quite helpful. So, for example, I used to be a spokesperson for the Polish permanent representation to the European Union. And before that, I was also a career diplomat in the Polish MFA, and I was working as a journalist and also as a public relations expert. And this part of my experience actually helps me craft messages very quickly, and also understand what is going on in the information space. Things happen very, very fast right now. And when you have the experience to decipher different messages, also in different languages, and I don't only mean foreign languages, which is also, something that is very helpful if you know them, but also decipher different registers, informal, formal, very, very informal slang, and so on and so forth. So if you have the ability to actually recognize different registers and sometimes what is written between the lines, it's very, very helpful. So I actually think everything that I did before is quite helpful in this job. But my experience is, well, it's just my experience. As far as my team is concerned, we have people in the team that have very different backgrounds. I have colleagues that, for example, worked for many years in Russia as journalists, as analysts, as diplomats. But I also have colleagues that know the Eastern Partnership region very well. And in a wider division that my team is part of, there are colleagues that deal with, for example, the MENA region or China as a malign information manipulation actor, or with other regions from the information manipulation perspective. And I think really, given how big of a challenge disinformation is right now, and how many different skills are really needed to tackle the challenge, I think almost every experience, every background could be useful.
And in terms of the platforms where it happens, because when you speak about disinformation, the common sense might be that it's happening on social media like Facebook or Twitter. But I assume the scope of platforms used to run disinformation campaigns also includes many others, like news websites and forums. Could you tell us a bit more about how that works?
Of course. Yes, one of the biggest problems with disinformation and information manipulation is that it happens everywhere. And most of us are on social media, on different ones. And so I very much agree with you that the reflex is to think that, yes, this happens mostly on social media. It does happen there big time. However, this is not everything. We have examples of Russian actors being present on Facebook, on Twitter, on Telegram very much, and on other social media as well. However, there are also examples of Russians trying out new platforms such as Discord. And there were also media reports quite recently how Russia is using games such as Minecraft to also peddle very well-known disinformation narratives. And still, it's not everything. We shouldn't forget also more traditional media. There's a lot of Russian TV channels that are still available in different parts of the world. They are not, many of them are not available anymore in the European Union due to EU sanctions, but still they are available elsewhere. And also it of course depends on which region, which country we're talking about, because the tactics are also different towards different audiences. Nevertheless, my point here is that we shouldn't forget also about offline media, newspapers in Georgia, for example, but also in other countries, which are still full of Russia-fueled narratives. So when we talk about disinformation and information manipulation, we usually use the word ecosystem, because it really is a very systemic approach to manipulate and to disinform us. So media is a huge part of this, or so-called media, I should rather say, because they don't really adhere to any media standards. But there's much more than that. What you can hear from Putin, from Lavrov, from other Kremlin officials is exactly the same as you can hear on Russian TV, but also on those channels that are available worldwide, be it RT or Sputnik, which I think are the most infamous right now. But there are many more channels on social media, on different, as I mentioned before, gaming platforms. There is Russian Orthodox Church, which is also quite active, for example, in some African countries, and not only there. There is a whole network of organizations that is supposed to promote Ruski Mir in Europe, on other continents as well, that also peddle the same disinformation narrative. So we were really up against the whole ecosystem, which is, well, omnipresent.
It truly seems overwhelming when I hear you speak about it, but I'm sure at some point it's a war to be actually won. Maybe with the rise of new technologies. But before we get into that, I have one more question, because the EU is a community of countries with different languages, different differences, and also how people use the web and specific social media platforms. Therefore, I would like to ask if it's possible for you to have one playbook of how to address disinformation campaigns on on a global, on a EU level, or do you have to work out specific methods per country, per language?
It's both, actually. So, what we're trying to do at the EU level is to have a framework that everyone can use, and the framework, I think, really can be applied by any country. However, the nitty gritty, if you like, the details to work out is for member states or for other actors that deal with disinformation. And when I say framework, I mean, well, four basic pillars of response. And this is something that we've been building for a few years, and this is how we know that it's actually working. So the first pillar is so-called situational awareness. So you need to be informed, basically. You need to understand what's happening in the information space, in your language, and then draw some conclusions from it. And it may seem like a very logical and basic thing. However, it also takes quite an effort to build such a system that would be comprehensive and that would give you what you need, really, especially given the constant evolution of how disinformation tries to manipulate us, of different tactics, techniques, procedures that I mentioned before. So this is also, it takes time to build this. The second pillar is capacity building. So those are efforts that I described a little bit before. The third pillar is international cooperation, and I think this is absolutely crucial right now. And we saw this especially during the pandemic, but also with the war that Russia launched against Ukraine. It's really essential to talk to your partners, to recognize if we have the same understanding of the threat, if what we're seeing every day in the information environment is the same, and if there is anything that we can do together. So we work with NATO, with the US, with other countries and organizations that perceive the threat of disinformation in the same way. And quite obviously, we work very closely with EU member states, and we're here for them. And then the fourth pillar is disruption. So this is something that is a little bit less developed in comparison to other pillars. However, I think we made very significant steps since last year. So disruption is about, well, disrupting disinformation, making it more costly and more difficult, basically, to perform. I have been in this job long enough to realize that it's not very probable that we will stop disinformation. However, we can make it more difficult, and this is what we're focusing on. This is what sanctions against disinformation outlets are about, for example.
And can you share a specific example of when you were able to actually successfully counter a disinformation campaign and stop its impact?
Well, measuring impact of both disinformation and measures against it is very, very difficult. We kind of operate on human brain here. It's it's possible, for example, through social polling, to see whether a disinformation narrative was successful or not. And we can see it in polling and in research done by many different organizations. Globsec is one great example. Um, However, we don't have the tools to be 100% sure if something worked properly or didn't work properly. But we do use social polling to actually understand this better, and also on a very basic level, I would say. Sometimes it just boils down to reaction of people that are wherever you are with your narrative. So, for example, last year we did this very simple video. It was on our Twitter of EU versus Info. That was in March last year. And that was right after Russia bombarded Mariupol. And we were quite shocked by what happened. But we were not very shocked when we saw Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, just lying on the record saying that Russia never attacked Ukraine and they certainly didn't do anything in Mariupol. And so we did a very, very simple thing. We published a 10-second video. On the left-hand side, you could see Lavrov saying those things. And on the right-hand side, you could see pictures from Mariupol, from the ground, really. Because, also we benefit from the fact that this is the whole war is really covered well by international and Ukrainian journalists very thoroughly. So there is so much evidence straight from the ground. And we also use it to tackle, in our communication efforts to tackle disinformation. So we basically confronted Russia with this. What happened a few weeks after, apart from the fact that the post went almost viral, it was quite popular. It was one of the most popular posts of ours last year. But what happened a few weeks after that? Russian MFA, on its Twitter account, actually retweeted our video and published its own, where they twisted disinformation as facts and facts as disinformation. And so we thought, should we do something about this? Should we react to it? But it's turned out very quickly that we didn't have to, because people reacted by themselves. So this post is still out there. You can actually look it up. People started reacting in quite a large scale to the post by Russian MFA saying, well, thank you for bringing EU versus Info to our attention. Now I follow them. And people just pushed back against what Russia said, how Russia lied, how it manipulated. In this particular case of Mariupol, people reacted themselves. So for me, it was a token or a sign that we're doing this right, that we're raising awareness, really, that people understand much better what disinformation is about, how it works, and especially how it works during the war. And this is, just one example. This is quite incidental, but there were many of such reactions of just, ordinary users of different social media to what Russia has been saying. So this is also, one of the signs that could tell us that, well, we're going in the right direction here.
And who you partner with in this fight against disinformation? Who are your allies?
Well, on the institutional or country level, because we're part of the European External Action Service, so-called European diplomacy. So obviously, our partners are member states of the European Union, institutions, and also institutions, mostly MFAs, but not exclusively, of countries, of like-minded countries, such as, for example, the United States, such as Japan, such as the UK, and other countries who perceive the threat the same way. But we also work very much with civil society. So our partners include civil society organizations from different regions that we work with. My team is focused on the Eastern Partnership countries, Central Asia. We do more and more in the region as well, as much as this is possible, also given our limited capacity. But there are also other regions covered by other teams in our division that we work closely with, and so they work with civil society as well. We do a lot with independent journalists as well from different countries, and I think it will not be a surprise to you when I say that we have been focusing a lot on Ukrainian civil society organizations and journalists. And this has been the case, well, much more so since the 24th of February, but it was also the case before. So, what we try to do is we try to build capacity that I mentioned before, but we also try to bring their voices to the Western audience. So many readers or many members of the audience of EU versus Info, for example, come from EU countries, from the US, well, from the so-called West in general. Not all of them, of course, but a significant chunk of the audience is from the West or in the West. And so we felt, especially when the war started, that those voices from the region, specifically from Ukraine, would really have to be heard more. I think we learned quite a lot since then, but you may remember that at the beginning of the war, it was not that obvious that people wanted to read Ukrainian newspapers, for example, or Ukrainian media in general. Many of them obviously are in English, good English, so much more available. But, you know, people were really well, in chaos, as all of us were, and they were looking for credible information from the ground, and they didn't know where to find it. So we felt it's part of our job to actually tell them these are great journalists. You can see their work for yourself. We did a lot of interviews. We invited them also to EU versus Info to cover different topics. And there is a separate section for guest content on our website, which you can see and also learn from it. And so, yes, we do a lot of things together with journalists and civil society, and I would say these are one of the most important partners of ours.
And what does AI mean for you? The rise of AI nowadays, this year especially, is it a new useful tool, or maybe does it make the threat more difficult to tackle, or maybe both?
I think it's both. Remains to be seen, of course. However, I like to think about AI in general as an opportunity for us. Some of the work that we do is quite tedious, I would say. For example, when you look at EU versus Disinfo website, there is our flagship project there, which is the database, a database of disinformation narratives. We've been updating this database every week for the last 8 years. And we have over 15,000 examples right now. This takes work, obviously. And I think this is where the AI could help us a little bit. I mean, there will always be a human factor, a human, or an actual human involved in this kind of work. It has to be this way. Nevertheless, I think, well, a degree of automation, a degree of AI involvement, let's call it that, would be really helpful to, for example, detect more, reach more audiences, and be faster in some of the things that we do. That said, I also think, I'm quite convinced actually, that this is part of a threat as well. I mean, if we can use it, then disinformation actors can use it as well. And so, I remember talking to a colleague about a year ago when there was this video of President Zelensky published that was actually a deep fake, it turned out. And it was fairly easy to recognize that it was not true. However, I think over a year after that, we can actually we will be able to see at some point a video that would be so much more difficult to distinguish from reality. I mean, we all need to learn how to actually recognize deepfakes, for example, much better. And we also need to have a much more comprehensive understanding of how the AI in general can be used by disinformation actors. What is certain for me at this point is that disinformation will become even more present because of the AI. Because it's just, you can use it to produce more messages, more false narratives, faster, in different languages. It just saves you time. So So yes, this is a challenge, but I do hope there will be also tools, AI based, that will help us fight with this. So, it's 50-50 for me.
But would you agree with the statement that we're at the point, and it wasn't very different so far, but now we're clearly at the point that the technology used by disinformation actors is so advanced that for an average internet user, for the average European, it's almost impossible to notice if something is fake or not?
That really depends. Um, excuse me. Uh, so there are cases where videos, for example, are difficult to recognize if they are true or they aren't. But at the same time, at least Russia's disinformation has never really been about quality. It's much more about quantity, and this is actually why this fight against it is so difficult at times. I mentioned before that disinformation is everywhere, and so it's hardly ever about a very sophisticated message crafted by many people in different languages, with all the commas and the right language and all that. It's rather about being messy but being quick. And so sometimes you can see, for example, in the Polish language, those Russian messages that actually, when you speak Polish, you can see when the translation into Polish came from Russian, right? We have all those hints. We're quite sensitive to them as Polish people, and so this happens quite a lot. Ukrainians know this very well too, because Russians sometimes are quite clumsy when they translate from Russian to Ukrainian. Um, so this is only about the language, but also this is about this example was about the language, but this is also about posting different videos or images or anything else. It's much more about going at scale than doing it in a very elegant and nice way and sophisticated way. So I think this is more of a problem than really anything else. The fact that it's everywhere. So even if you're an expert on this information manipulation, even if you know the messages pushed by Russia and other disinformation actors by heart, you can still fall victim of disinformation, because when it attacks you from every possible corner, well, this is what happens. Sometimes you just don't have the strength to defend yourself anymore.
You, as an expert, you probably easily spot disinformation narratives because you've seen them so many times in different forms. But what advice do you usually give family and friends how to stay aware of how to spot if something is a false narrative, might be a disinformation campaign?
Hmm. Well, one of the basic things that I always say is follow EU versus info, and to be up to date. You can even get a newsletter every week with basic trends, and you can be informed in what is happening in the information environment as far as disinformation is concerned. So this is a very basic thing to do, I hope, but also in a broader way. I always encourage my colleagues and my friends and my family to have their favorite fact checking organization. Because we're here to cover EU and Eastern Partnership at large. However, sometimes you need someone to speak your own language. It's as basic as that. So when you're Spanish, look for Maldita, for example, which is one of the most known Spanish fact-checking organizations. When you're in Poland, look for Demagog, and there are plenty of other organizations that do this great work. Sometimes I feel underappreciated. Also, have your favorite media that you follow, but try not to stay inside of your own bubble all the time. I think it's very, very healthy to get out of the bubble every now and then and look for opinions that actually don't confirm what you think you know. I think really it should be a reflex that we should all do. And then a very unpopular thing that I really like to to recommend is not to share stuff on social media, or really try to limit yourself when you do that. Think about the consequences and think about whether it's really necessary to share things that you deem curious, that you deem quite strange, or just stupid. You actually may give them fuel, and it's not needed. So one of the fact checkers told me, Ukrainian fact checkers told me last year that her grandma always said, before you make any decisions, go make yourself a cup of tea. And I think this is a very good advice when you use social media, really. Not a very popular
Before
one.
you
I know
share a
we're all
link.
in a hurry, but
But it's actually very good advice, because there has been some time ago articles. I remember. I don't remember the number of it, but there were reports from social media platforms that a number of posts or articles are shared without even opening the link.
Mhm.
So people share information just because the link they saw uh, makes them want to share that with their audience. And I'm sure this is one of
Exactly.
the most dangerous ways to actually spread information without control. One last thing I wanted to ask you, because most of the time we spoke about uh, campaigns that are addressing the general public, um, but do you see that there are some specific campaigns targeting more, the professional, the professional crowds, industries, maybe the EU bubble, maybe lawmakers that are maybe more sophisticated to some extent?
Well, there are campaigns targeting the European Parliament, for example, or specific MEPs, for example, if we're talking about lawmakers, or specific politicians in general. Of course, that this happens whenever there's an opportunity for the Kremlin. And Russia is quite good actually at jumping at opportunities, using them. And when I say opportunities, I mean, for example, a certain political development. So, when, for example, the European Parliament a few years ago adopted a resolution um, about about the need to to fight disinformation in general, it was heavily attacked as being Russophobic. So this is one of the really classic examples, because then the Kremlin actors perceived this as a threat to themselves, and use the opportunity to attack the parliament. And this is really, as I said, one of the really classic examples. Well, yes, I'll stop there perhaps, but well, maybe I'll say one more thing. It is quite often the case that well, yes, we do talk about campaigns that are about general public, about reaching different audiences at the same time. However, Russia, because it also has the whole backing of the state in terms of finances, it actually has a lot of money to perform disinformation with all its malign practices. And so it's able to reach different audiences in different languages on different channels. And so, uh, yes, different industries, different topics are being covered depending on the situation. And I think it will not come as a surprise when I say that last winter, for example, the energy industry was heavily attacked, and the EU as a whole was also attacked for, um, well, going away from Russian supplies of gas. And there was this narrative, in quite a funny way sometimes, and quite a clumsy way as well, pushed by Russia, that Europe will freeze. So there were, for example, videos of horse-drawn carriages that were drawing the cars because, well, cars were out of fuel. And so, this is how they portrayed the winter in Europe. But this is just, one of the examples where actually disinformation campaign was hugely unsuccessful, because even though we were quite afraid of how winter will look, we all survived.
So sometimes it just doesn't work out because the narrative is wrongly targeted, or they don't understand the real situation they're addressing with their campaign.
Indeed, and also I think I really could see it last year. I can see it still. The awareness of disinformation is so much higher. I don't want to say that it's all perfect and we are all resilient now, because we really aren't. Nevertheless, when I compare the situation from, say, 2 years ago to what we see now, the awareness, especially in the European Union, of disinformation, of how it works, and what one can do about it, is so much bigger. And so it's much more difficult for Russia and for others to actually keep disinforming.
That's, I think, a great information to finish our interview with. So thank you for this. First of all, lots of very useful insights, and the look into how the European Union is fighting disinformation, but also for this rather positive assessment of where we are, and how we are hopefully the winning side of this war. So thank you very much, Martyna, for your time today, and thank you everyone for listening to our interview.
Thank you very much.